Hi, everyone, and welcome to In Conversation, a brand new podcast from the Pearson Centre for Progressive Policy. I'm Scott Sims, President and CEO. We're going to start our series with a great topic, of course, Lester Pearson and John Diefenbaker in this brand new book called The Duel by John Ibbitson. Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada. We sat down with the author to talk about these two extraordinary gentlemen, former prime ministers, who helped shape this country. We hope you enjoy. John Ibbitson, what can I say but congratulations, sir, on a fine piece of work. I learned many things. Was it as much a joy to write as it was to read?
Well, thank you, Scott. Yes is the simple answer. I mean, I've done a fair number of books over the course of my life, but I never enjoyed writing one as much as I enjoyed this. It was 4 years. I started it in the summer of 2019. But usually a book goes through stages, and the last stage is my blankety blank book. Never got to that stage. It was always just a pleasure to get up in the morning knowing, hey, today's a writing day. I get to work on the Duel.
That is fantastic, The Duel. So I want to start into something that that genuinely surprised me about this book. Not that I'm surprised you're a good writer. It's just that when I was reading it, when I read these biographies, if this was a standalone about just Diefenbaker or just Pearson, I've read these biographies where you get into the machinations of the individual, so on and so forth. But what I liked about this book was a rich illustration of history, because I was born shortly after Expo, so I think about the past 50 years in my life, and there have been a lot of change. But I had forgotten how much Canada had become the nation that it is today from that period of World War I up until, say, Expo or the early 70s, when these two gentlemen exited politics and unfortunately, in some cases, passed away. But nevertheless, so much happened.
Yeah, and again, that was one of the purposes of the book.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell the story of the country as well as the story of the two men. Or tell the story of the country through the two men, because they were both born in small town Ontario of reasonably modest backgrounds at a time when Canada was little more than a colony, barely self-governing dominion within the British Empire. Victoria was on the throne. And they fought over the disposition of nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. The arc of their life was the arc of the country's life as well, from Victorian to pre-centennial Canada. And even people who are, reasonably well versed in Canadian history may know about the Confederation, may know about the two world wars and the conscription crises, know about the Depression, and then know about Centennial and Pierre Trudeau, but may think that nothing seemed to happen from 1945 to 1967, when in fact a great deal happened in those decades. And in fact, the Canada that we inherited ourselves was in fact forged during those two prime ministerships.
And to me, the backdrop was not so much the backdrop as it was the foreground of the history of this country way back when. I mean, I learned quite a bit from some of the machinations that happened, like certainly with the international relations. I mean, how, like, for instance, Canada was a major player between this triumvirate, which was, the UK, United States, and Canada. And of course, Pearson was a big part of that, our namesake. But nevertheless, the importance of Canada at that time was far more than I realized.
Well, again, we were telling the story of the world's history as well as Canada's history, because we were in the early years of John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson, essentially a dominion of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. Our progress matched the steady decline of the British Empire and the rise of the American Empire and the transfer of power from London to Washington. And navigating that transfer was part of the job that both John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson had as prime ministers.
And you mentioned it earlier, which I found very interesting, was you talk about these two men. Now, there are similarities at the beginning and there's similarity at the end. And the only similarity at the beginning was, as your chapter describes, one was the teacher's son, the other was the preacher's son.
That's correct.
And in between that time, the only position that they had of similarity was Prime Minister of Canada. In between, there were two solitudes, polar opposite. One, for example, in the early stage, they realized one was a singularity, solitary person who enjoyed fishing, and the other was definitely into baseball. Pearson was a team player.
Absolutely, and it marked their prime ministerships as well.
Mm.
I mean, the key event was the Diefenbakers moving to Saskatchewan
Mm.
when John was 8. Before that, they were leading similar lives, itinerant sons of a minister and a teacher, sort of hopping between villages in southern Ontario. But then the Diefenbakers went west and moved to Saskatchewan, and Diefenbaker became the son of a poor and not poor in every sense farmer, not very prosperous and not very good, and developed the personality that we knew in adulthood of essentially a solitary and in some ways antagonistic and resentful figure.
Yeah, in many cases he was, because I looked at the polar opposites in their lifestyle, which was one was obviously jettisoning between Washington, London, as a young person who was involved in it almost seemed like he was an accidental tourist in many cases, starting out as an academic and then moving on, talking about Pearson, of course, moving on to the public service. But then you had the opposite experience of Diefenbaker, who was, I have to admit, he really was the champion of that little person, wasn't he? He in his legal practice.
That's perfectly true. Diefenbaker for the defense,
Yeah.
as the book called it. In some ways, he became prominent before Pearson, certainly within in the prairies. He had a very successful law practice in Prince Albert, but he also believed that people who couldn't afford a lawyer and who were in a great deal of trouble deserved representation. And he gave that representation. Diefenbaker was in many ways Canada's first and only populist prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
He was supported by the little guy, as Ontario Premier Doug Ford likes to call them. But he was a little guy himself. His populism was rooted in his own upbringing. He is the only prime minister who sat in jail cell while a sobbing woman explained why she buried her dead baby without telling anyone the baby had even been born. He's the one who represented the woman who tried to explain why she had to kill her husband or her husband was going to kill her. He was the one who fought to save from execution at least one man who had been diagnosed as having the IQ of a child. And he worked among and represented the people that he grew up among. And he never lost that bond with them, and nor they with him. Diefenbaker's populism was a populism rooted in who he was. It was an honest populism.
Do you think because it seems to me that obviously he had a desire to be an elected person before Pearson did.
Absolutely, and he wasn't very good at it. I mean, he had 5 tries, I believe. Before he got into the House of Commons. Finally, he was already in his 40s.
Twice federally, twice provincially, and one for mayor.
But he got there before Pearson did. But he got there as a backbencher in a party that never won elections, and very quickly became estranged from the leadership of his own party. He was not liked within the senior ranks of the Conservative and then the Progressive Conservative Party. If you in 1950 had said Mike Pearson is going to be prime minister one day, no one would have been surprised. They would say, well, he was a great diplomat. He was a Undersecretary of State for External Affairs. Now he's the Minister for Foreign Affairs. That he's going to succeed Sanaroff seemed likely. If you had said in 1950 that John Diefenbaker would be prime minister and would be prime minister before Pearson, people would have thought you were nuts, because he was an unpopular backbencher in a party that never won elections.
They were when I think about Pearson going back at that time, it seemed like his ambition was there, but it seemed like his ambition was only in the moment of where he was at the time. As you just pointed out, I mean, if you had said Dief would have been prime minister beforehand, I don't think so. But nevertheless, he was, and it astonishes me. It astonishes me how they both came out with such different backgrounds, and because they were different, even though they were different backgrounds, a lot of the policies and ideologies they believed in were similar. Not so obviously, they probably had different methods of execution, but similar in the sense of equal rights, they both seem to have a fundamental belief in equal rights, and their policies showed through that.
Well, and it gets to one of the core themes of the book.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to tell the story of both men, and for two reasons. I wanted to take a second look at the prime ministership of John Diefenbaker. His governments have been dismissed as
Yes.
failures. In fact, I think, however temperamental Diefenbaker might have been himself, his governments were quite successful. Launched major initiatives in healthcare, in immigration, in justice reform, in human rights, both domestically and internationally. That the Pearson governments then picked up on and codified and advanced. And I think if you're going to talk about the creation of modern Canada, the creation of the welfare state, then you have to talk about the initiatives that Diefenbaker launched and that Pearson brought to fruition. And that was one reason for the book. The other reason was such a great story, right? These two guys fought each other for a decade. It has never happened before or since in Canadian history where the leader of the Conservative and Liberal parties fought tooth and nail on the floor of the House of Commons and through 4 elections for power. It was just such a good story to tell.
Do you think that they respected each other?
They certainly did at the beginning when Mike Pearson was External Affairs Minister and John Diefenbaker was External Affairs critic.
Yeah.
We don't need to get into the details, but the Americans were trying to destroy the career of a Canadian diplomat, and Pearson came to his defense, and Diefenbaker came to his defense as well. And indeed, Pearson sent a note across the aisle, in essence, thanking Diefenbaker for his support. But any two leaders who are going to fight each other for a decade are not going to be the best of friends at the end of it. And they actually quite despised each other by the end of certainly Lester Pearson despised John Diefenbaker because he made his life hell as prime minister through those 5 years. I think Diefenbaker probably didn't despise Pearson. He was just the prey across the floor.
That's right.
That he was hunting,
Yeah.
and did so with considerable glee.
If there's one thing that I would say Diefenbaker had over, and this certainly came through in your book, one thing that Diefenbaker had over Pearson was he was better at reading the room.
Yes, he was a better natural politician, even though he lost all those elections.
Mhm.
I guess because of the environment that he grew up in, the people that he lived among in Saskatchewan. He was, it's hard to believe it now, but in his days, the Conservatives in Saskatchewan were so few in number that Diefenbaker used to joke that the only thing that protected Conservatives were the game laws. So he worked his way through that environment, a political environment, in essence. Mike Pearson, on the other hand, came up through the bureaucracy. He worked in one of the first officers for the new Department of External Affairs in the 1920s, worked his way up to becoming American ambassador, and then Undersecretary of State, and then Secretary of State. So his was, it seemed a natural, almost an inevitable evolution towards the ultimate power of the prime ministership. Although he claimed he never had any ambition at all, he did, by the way. But it was a subtle ambition.
Right. I think there's a passage in your book I'll get to in the moment talks about Pearson, and he had he stumbled onto the job as with. It's all like something he pretended that this is what happened, but in actual fact that wasn't the case. But I just want to go back earlier into Pearson's career for a moment. When he started, we talk about the external affairs was this room above a barber shop on Bank Street.
That's right. Its job was to handle correspondence between the prime minister and Downing Street and Whitehall. But then, with the Balfour Declaration and the Statute of Westminster, Canada suddenly was developing its own foreign policy. We went automatically to war in the First World War as a dominion of the British Empire. We declared war on our own in the Second World War. And that evolution is the evolution of Canada as a sovereign state. And yes, Lester Pearson was in on the ground floor of that. O.D. Skelton appointed him as one of the very first people to come to work in the department.
He certainly never started at the top, but certainly, as the expression goes, he did the heavy lifting to get to the point where they had become such a large department for the government.
He did indeed. They all did, mind you. That group, Robertson and Wrong and Pearson and the others, were superb diplomats. It was a golden age in some ways for Canadian foreign policy. But yes, they took this newly created, essentially newly created department, and fashioned it into the foreign affairs department of one of the major middle powers by the end of the Second World War.
When I was also taken back by it. One of the things about Diefenbaker, that when he first got to Parliament, he had difficulty getting along, as it were. We talk about, you look at the situation we have today. Obviously, you have Pierre Poilievre, who's now the leader of Conservatives. Now, I was there when he was there, and he was quite the team player, and he made his way up through those ranks by being that team player. And there are other examples in today's world of any leader politically. You have to go along with the team to be in charge of the team, as it were. Trudeau could be a bit of an exception, but, he came in from the outside. However, when Diefenbaker got to Ottawa, it wasn't an easy ride for him, even for his own people.
Absolutely not. He was, first of all, a conservative from Saskatchewan,
Right.
very rare, the only one in caucus. The Conservative Party was very much the party of Bay Street. It was the party of the Ontario business class, and to some extent the English business class in Montreal. And that is one reason, among several, why it lost so many elections. It had such
That's
a
right.
narrow base.
Yeah.
And here was this populist son of a farmer, lawyer from Saskatchewan, who's in a party of essentially Ontario Anglo fat cats, and who was by nature not a get along kind of guy anyway. So he very quickly became unpopular within the senior ranks of the party. Not so much within the caucus itself, but within the senior ranks of the party, he was highly unpopular. It's a miracle that he ever managed the leadership. A fluke, really.
Yeah. If there's something I want to read from your book, if that's all right.
Of course.
Something you wrote here, and I when you define Pearson this way, and we talked about it earlier about I don't know if he gives off the impression that he's somewhat of an accidental tourist, but you say in your book, if we are to believe Lester Pearson's self-narrative that he had drifted into academia, stumbled into the Foreign Service more or less by accident, received repeated promotions without seeking them, been talked into elected office against his will, assumed the Liberal leadership without wanting or asking for it, then this was the big career decision he'd ever made, a decision to buck the odds and stay and fight rather than drift into retirement, which led me to believe that he may have come across that way. But his single determination was to have that job to make a difference for Lester Pearson. And that was when, of course, there was a huge defeat on his hand.
That's right. So those who were around Pearson always smiled when Pearson maintained that it was all an accident. He never asked for it. He was forced to.
Of course.
Duty called him to
Poor
serve
guy.
the party.
Yeah.
He was an ambitious politician. He was ambitious as a bureaucrat to get to the top of the public service, and he was ambitious as a politician to win the prime ministership. But as you say, he and everyone else assumed he would become leader of the Liberal Party and prime minister. Instead, he became leader of the Liberal Party and opposition leader, and then proceeded through his own mismanagement to lead John Diefenbaker to call an election that produced the largest majority at that time in Canadian history for the Conservatives.
Well, we hope you're enjoying this podcast with John Ibbitson and his new book, The Duel. We want to thank our partners who make this possible. We want to thank the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CAP, the trusted voice of the Canadian upstream oil and natural gas industry, working to ensure Canada is the preferred source of safe, secure, reliable, affordable, and responsibly produced energy to meet the growing needs of Canada and the world. And now back to our podcast. So, John, I as I mentioned earlier, I mean, there are certain. You're right about the Diefenbaker aspect of it. I know Paul Wells wrote about it as well in his article about this book and Diefenbaker's accomplishments. And this is coming from the president and CEO of the Pearson Centre. so it's quite something. But I look at the accomplishment he made, winning that massive majority. The timing was right. And one of the things that he did well, that I believe that Pearson could not do, was master the House of Commons.
Always. Diefenbaker was a master on the floor of the House of Commons, perhaps more successfully in opposition than as prime minister, maybe even happier in opposition than as prime minister. But that, again, plays into a stereotype that I don't want to play into, which suggests that Diefenbaker was never really much of a prime minister, more just a theatrical presence on the floor of the House. And that's not true. Again, the book argues that in areas of immigration reform, in areas of healthcare reform, in human rights policy, again, both domestically and internationally, and we can talk about this, one major initiative after another was launched by the Diefenbaker government and then brought to fruition by the Pearson government. That's why, although it was a duel, it was also, in some strange ways, a partnership, though neither of them would have ever looked upon the other as a partner.
That's a valid point. I'm sorry to interrupt you right there, but that's that's the best way of looking at this. Is this is more of a partnership than what it was, because when you talk about how Louis Saint Laurent brought in the old age security, and that was even enhanced by Diefenbaker going forward. And then, of course, the crown on top of that was the CPP, kind of pension plan, which was, as you admit in your book, it took a lot of courage for Pearson to do that. But it also took a genuine understanding of a program that was put before him before he got there.
Absolutely. Again, to try to reassess more positively the Diefenbaker legacy is not in any way to diminish the Pearson legacy. Let's look at immigration, if I may, just as one example.
Okay.
Up until 1957, the most racist place in Canada was the Immigration Department. Its job was to keep Canada white. Its job was to keep people who were not American or European out of Canada.
Astonishing.
And Diefenbaker appointed Ellen Fairclough, the first woman cabinet minister, by the way, to immigration with a mandate to clean it up, because he himself had been discriminated against throughout his life as a result of his German name. People today would find that remarkable, but in those days, this was true. And it took Fairclough 5 years because she essentially had to tear the department apart and put it back together again. But she managed in 1962, she stood up and announced a new order in council that said, from this day on, the color of your skin, your religion, your race, the country that you come from, or the part of the world you come from, shall have no bearing on your application to come to Canada as what was then called a landed immigrant. That you would be your application would be adjudicated solely on the contribution that you could make to the life of your country. And then when Pearson came into power, they codified that in the point system, which I have always said is perhaps Canada's greatest gift to the world. And multiculturalism, the country that we have today, the multi-hued, multifaceted polyglot that makes Canada so fabulous, is the result of policies inaugurated by the Diefenbaker government and then codified by the Pearson government in the area of immigration.
When you describe Ellen Fairclough and you talk about her moving speeches about, eliminating race, creed, color when it comes to immigration, as you pointed out, in today's context, would it be fair to say, and that came from a conservative?
Yes, it would be fair even today, I suppose, to say that came from a conservative. But let's not forget who was the author of the Bill of Rights. It was John Diefenbaker, and he had been advocating for a Bill of Rights since he was a backbench MP. And he described the Bill of Rights as his greatest achievement as Prime Minister. Now the Supreme Court ultimately defenestrated the bill, but as retired Justice Rosalie Abella maintains in the book, he still put the idea of rights on the agenda. Pierre Trudeau liked John Diefenbaker, had him over for lunch at 24 Sussex, because Trudeau was trying to achieve exactly what Diefenbaker had launched, which was to entrench a code of rights and freedoms into a new constitution. Diefenbaker began that agenda with his Bill of Rights. Diefenbaker's government extended the franchise to First Nations. When Nelson Mandela came to Canada to speak to Parliament very shortly after he'd been released from prison, he thanked Brian Mulroney for his stalwart opposition to apartheid in South Africa, and then thanked John Diefenbaker as the first of the Western leaders to take Canada out of the mix and say, no, Canada will not support South Africa's application to enter the Commonwealth because of apartheid.
And as you point out in the book, it was actually Canada with African nations of the Commonwealth.
Exactly so.
So we were, I guess, we were the only predominantly white nation who said no to South Africa.
And the British and the Australians were furious with us, thought that we had betrayed
Right.
the side. But Diefenbaker said, I am not going to be a prime minister who supports an apartheid regime.
Hmm. I just want to read from your book again, and just to end off the discussion we're having with Diefenbaker, because of all these triumphs that he had and the large majority that he won, it only lasted for one term, which to me is surprising. Justin Trudeau had a large majority. He got a minority later. Mulroney had one, the largest in history, followed by another, but he only lasted, a term after that. But it astonished me how only that large majority only gave him 4 years. But in that time, and I go to your book again, getting things done for Canada and Canadians. This was Pearson's record when he was running again. He seemed like at this point, personally, he was running out of steam.
This is Diefenbaker running again.
Diefenbaker, yes. And let's talk about, he campaigned on the past 5 years. And if you list the last 5 years of his reign at that time, increases price supports for farmers, grain sales to China, which was not very popular, but certainly progressive. Bill of Rights, as you pointed out, public hospital care, the precursor to what Pearson brought in, the almost completed Trans-Canada Highway, which is in a country this size, that's quite something, roads to resources, lower income and corporate taxes, fiscal rebalancing with the provinces, increased financial support for universities, immigration policy that no longer discriminated against non-Europeans, as you point out. But then it goes on to say, and you write in your book, any government in the progressive post-war era with such a record could credibly have asked for a strong second mandate. But there was the Avro Arrow and the Coin affair. Even worse, Diefenbaker had been branded in the public mind as a preening and dithering leader for which he had only himself to blame.
So and all of that is, I think, true.
Yeah.
Diefenbaker squandered the largest majority government up until that time.
Right.
Because he had difficulty making decisions, because he had essentially a strong streak of paranoia, because he didn't trust his own cabinet, and didn't trust the bureaucracy. And I would distinguish only, though, between the Avro Arrow and the Coin affair. The Coin affair, in which Diefenbaker tried and failed to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, was the worst incompetence of his government. But the Avro Arrow decision was the right decision. In fact, it was a decision that had been made by the Sanarol government before. They had simply not announced it publicly yet. There was no reason for the Avro Arrow. An interceptor fighter had been made redundant by the intercontinental ballistic missile, and no other country was prepared to buy the plane, even if we did manufacture it.
Yeah, you spent some time on that issue in the book, and I'm glad you did, because every issue is, when we look back on it, seems easy enough to do in a black and white context. But there's a lot of gray matter in there, and there's a lot of complexities to this. And some of the complexities come through in this book that you point out, which is true about the Avro Arrow. Because when we look back at it, we think to ourselves, why did we get rid of that? I mean, we spent so much money. It was a great plane. However, the context wasn't as easy as we like to think.
No, and and could Diefenbaker have handled the announcement better? Absolutely, he could have. He should have made it quicker and cleaner.
Yeah.
But he delayed for as long as he could because he was trying to find something else for Avro to do, right? Rather than just cancel the plane and destroy the country.
15,000 jobs or
something.
something.
Yeah, which, and again, it could have been handled better by the company as well. But the Pearson Liberals never criticized the decision. They criticized the execution of the decision, because Mike Pearson was sitting at the cabinet table when the Sanarol government made exactly the same decision just before the 1957 election, assuming that they would win that election and then make the announcement.
That's right. But this is another fascinating part of the book that I find out. You talk about two completely different people feeding off each other. And you point out how when Pearson lost, he had plowed himself into something, and as quoted earlier, this was something he wanted to do. His wife made the joke on the night of the devastating defeat when Diefenbaker won the huge victory. She said, "This was a horrible night. Not only did we lose so badly in the election," I'm paraphrasing, "not only did we lose so badly in the election, but we won our riding," which means we're still there. And at that point, that's true, because Pearson could have went on and done something else. He had a full buffet of opportunity, we'll say, given who he was. But he plowed himself in the job of being leader of the opposition.
And which is commendable because
Yeah.
you're right. He had no reason to believe he was going to be prime minister anytime soon.
Mm.
The Liberals had suffered a devastating defeat, and he had led them to that devastating defeat.
Mm.
He could have gone on. There would have been jobs at the UN. There would have been jobs at NATO. There would have been chairmanship of this commission and that. Instead, he said, "No, I'm going to stick this out. We have to rebuild the Liberal Party pretty much from scratch, and I'm going to take on that rebuilding." And he did it very successfully.
But he did it the way he did best, which was policy, right? If you look at it now, if one of the things that many leaders do, including Diefenbaker, is okay. Now you're in the opposition. What do? You build. You go to church basements. You do the train tours. Nowadays you do everything digital. You're on Facebook Live. In addition to touring, you have to go out and be tangible to the people. They have to see you. All that retail political stuff. But Pearson really got into the Kingston Conference, and following the Thinkers Conference, I guess it was called, but following that, it became policy levers that the party used to their benefit.
And very politically astute policy levers at that. Absolutely.
Yes.
So he had an advantage. It was a small caucus, but it was a deeply qualified caucus because much of it had been in cabinet. So he left his front bench to do the day-to-day on the floor of the House of Commons, knowing that these were people like Paul Martin Sr., for example, who were very, very knowledgeable and could carry the argument.
Mm-hmm.
And the refinancing was largely left to Walter Gordon, the very wealthy accountant, and he would become Pearson's finance minister. Pearson and his aide Tom Kent focused on moving the party to the left, coming up with a more progressive agenda. And then, we don't need to get into the details of it here, when there was a huge fight over whether Canada should accept continental missiles, the Beaumark anti-missile system, he switched the Liberal Party from one of opposition to nuclear weapons to one of support for nuclear weapons.
I was surprised by that.
Yes, but the Americans were livid that the Diefenbaker government would not accept nuclear-tipped weapons, would not for the Beaumark missiles and for Canadian planes in Europe. They were furious. And Pearson knew that if he switched from a position of opposition to a position of support, he would have the deep gratitude of the Kennedy administration. And as he said in a documentary series, and it's delightful to watch him on the camera, he said it was the right thing to do, and it was also very wise. And then he gave this sort of Pearsonian grin.
I'm glad we're on video so people can see what you just did. And that's a Pearsonian grin you mentioned in the book. Yes.
And that helped him ultimately to win power.
Yeah, and it's again one of his major weaknesses, obviously, on the House of Commons on the floor. And from your book, there's a great story in there where Pearson got up to ask as leader of the opposition, and tried to do the best attack that he could, being in opposition, and he was, let's say, eviscerated by the abilities of Diefenbaker in his speech. And CCF MP Colin Cameron chastised Diefenbaker. He said, quote, "When I saw him bring whole batteries of rhetoric, whole arsenals of guided missiles, of vitriol and invective in order to shoot one forlorn sitting duck," meaning Pearson, a sitting duck indeed, already crippled with a self-inflicted wound, he told the House, I wonder if Diefenbaker really believes in the humane slaughter of animals. The Prime Minister," and Pearson even said, "The Prime Minister tore me to shreds."
He did. So Pearson had made this terrible mistake. He had won the leadership of the party.
That's
and
what I
at the convention, he said, "I'm going to bring down this government at the first opportunity," which was a lovely thing to say to delegates at a Liberal convention.
Sorry to interrupt. Does that go back to reading the room?
Well, he was reading the Liberal room then.
That's right. Okay,
but the room of a political leadership convention is not the room of the House of Commons.
Exactly.
And so he came in and literally said to Diefenbaker, "You should resign because you're so incompetent. But don't call an election. Instead, invite me to become Prime Minister, and the Liberals will return to doing what they have done for so many decades in the past, which is governing." Diefenbaker had in his pocket a memo from Mitchell Sharp, who was then a senior bureaucrat, to the Central government, warning of an oncoming recession and saying that the government was not prepared for the recession, um, uh, and the Liberals had denied there was any kind of economic downturn happening at all during the election campaign. So I can't remember the exact words, but Diefenbaker turned to the guy beside him and said, "I've got him," and gets up and just eviscerates him, waving this memo saying,
right.
"You knew
knew."
hard times were coming, and what did you do? Nothing at all."
Wow.
And by the time he was done, everyone in the House of Commons knew that Pearson had been destroyed. And it was only a matter of time, and it wasn't very long before Diefenbaker dissolved the House, and we got the 58 victory. With, by the way, I think one of the most amazing platform mottos or slogans I've ever heard in my life, which was just "Follow John."
Follow John.
Follow John. That was the entire campaign mantra for the 58 election. Follow John.
I think it may have been Dalton Camp who had this strategy to just focus on John Diefenbaker, not on the party banner.
And to us,
I lived through as a politician, by the way, on several, whether it was Paul Martin's Liberals and Team Trudeau.
and with us that sounds natural. But one of the points that someone made in the book, Doug Fisher actually, made in the book was that until Diefenbaker, no one paid any attention to Ottawa. It was like an engine running in the background that unseen and unheard.
Yep.
Diefenbaker brought Ottawa front and center into the national life. And we have never, it's been there from that day to this. So it was extraordinary for the time, not for our times, but for their times, to focus an entire election campaign on just the leader of the party and nothing else.
Being a leader and being the smartest person in the room sometimes lands you in trouble. And I say that to also say one thing in my experience, was that, technology changes, but when it comes to the human nature of politics, there's nothing new under the sun. And when I read that, I didn't realize this till I read it about how Pearson was so bold as to say, "You should resign right now." And he didn't have the ability to read the room. We'll say, I remember when Stéphane Dion teamed up with Jack Layton to go to the Governor General and say, "Give the reins to us." And I was there at that time, and it reminded me of that so much. Boy, I don't think the leadership read the room at the time as to how the people felt. The Liberals were fine, the NDP were fine, the people not so much.
Well, but in Mike Pearson's defense, one of the things that I argue in the book is that he had no experience really as a politician when he became leader of the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
Even as a cabinet minister, he was really a diplomat, sitting in cabinet. But he did have the capacity to grow. He learned how to become leader of the Liberal Party. He learned how to rebuild the Liberal Party. He was never good on the campaign trail. And by his own admission, he had a bit of a lisp. The bow ties were off-putting. And he managed to snatch, almost defeat from the jaws of victory in both 63 and 65. They should have been majority governments.
Sure.
And it was John Diefenbaker and Mike Pearson who, between the two of them, returned them as minority governments instead.
But John, when I go through when I read your book and others, based on the politics of the time, politicians were more human back then. The idea of being humble in front of the mics was an easier task than it is now. Now we have to pretend to be perfectionists. Coming from Newfoundland, I watched a television interview one time of Don Jameson before he became a politician and Joey Smallwood. And they spent an hour in a free-flow conversation while he was premier, and it was astonishing. I mean, he had said things that would have made communications people cringe. And at the time, things that Pearson did and said, and even Diefenbaker, he was one of his greatest speeches he did on a campaign trail. He talked about humility and how he wants to be in check and he'll make mistakes. It's astonishing.
But of course, it was also a time in which television was just emerging.
Right.
And Marshall McLuhan had not yet offered up his theories. We certainly saw with the arrival of Pierre Trudeau the kind of politician you're talking about.
Yeah.
The politician who is comfortable in front of the camera, who is a political force. But this was a bit more of a black and white era rather than a color era. But still, an era in which an amazing amount got done that, in fact, Pierre Trudeau inherited.
Thanks again for joining us. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. This is, of course, with John Ibbitson, whose latest book, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada. Great book of history about two of the stalwarts of Canadian politics. And of course, this episode is brought to you with the generous help of our partners, including Canada's Building Trades Unions, the national voice of over 500,000 Canadian construction workers, members of 14 international unions who work in more than 60 different trades and occupations and generate 6% of this country's GDP. Thank you to the CBTU. And now back to our podcast. John, thanks again for joining us. I mean, this has been great. I really enjoyed your book, as I've mentioned several times. I just want to talk about Lester Pearson for a moment.
Sure.
I want to talk about a gentleman who was prime minister for a short period of time and in a minority. And if I could list some of the accomplishments, the new Canadian flag, Medicare, built upon others, yes, but still, pulling the plug on essentially what we have today. The Order of Canada, Expo 67, establishing the Royal Commission on the status of women, the Auto Pact, which you write about as well. It was a huge, huge thing. That took the grace and style of an individual like Pearson, I think, to actually pull that through. Canadian Development Corporation, you mentioned the point system, immigration, Canada Student Loan Program. That's a lot for a short period of time. How does someone like Pearson pull that off?
Well, I would argue in the book, first of all, he was a very able prime minister, and he had a very able cabinet.
Right.
And also, most of the things you've been described had already been launched on Diefenbaker's watch. Let's just very quickly talk about healthcare. Diefenbaker inaugurated universal public hospital care. So for the first time, if you needed to go to the emergency ward or if you needed an operation, you didn't have to find the money for it or count on charity. That was a major innovation in public health care. Tommy Douglas was then Premier of Saskatchewan. He took the money and inaugurated Medicare, which expanding it to include primary care as well. Diefenbaker didn't feel he had a mandate for that, but he established a Royal Commission on Healthcare, and he put his good friend Emmett Hall on the commission, a good Saskatchewan boy. They'd gone to law school together, and Hall and Diefenbaker and Tommy Douglas all were cut from the same cloth. They all knew each other, and Diefenbaker knew when he put Emmett Hall into that position exactly what Emmett Hall was going to recommend. It just happened that by the time Hall released his recommendations, Pearson was prime minister, and so Pearson implemented Medicare. This does not diminish in any way the achievement of Mike Pearson in bringing public health care to Canada, but he already was working on a foundation that had been laid by Diefenbaker.
And all that could be said about the Canada Pension Plan as well.
And university education
Yes.
funding and other things.
Quick question then. And I'm going to ask you this question in the context of today. I asked myself the same question. This dynamic, I'll read the first part of your epilogue, I think sums it up
Sure.
pretty well. The single greatest difference between Lester Bowles Pearson and John George Diefenbaker was in their ability to grow. Pearson could, Diefenbaker couldn't. Pearson's views on Britain and its empire, on the United States, on developing countries, on federalism all evolved. Diefenbaker really changed his mind and never admitted he had. One good example was a Liberal Prime Minister's flexibility was Pearson's attitude to women, and you go on and talk about that and how that evolved. But it seemed like they were always evolving, these two. They were evolving to the times between them, and all the animosity that was between them created some of the greatest progressive policies we have today.
That's right. Some of the greatest political theater we have today, too.
Sure.
But that was entrenched in the debate over the flag. Pearson knew that the British Empire was finished and that the American Empire was now what Canada had to contend with. And he knew as well that Canada was going to have to stand more on its own 2 feet, have a greater sense of self. And so he proposed a flag that which eventually became our flag. Diefenbaker fought it tooth and nail because he rightly saw that it would be severing Canada's legacy from the British Empire, and he remained rooted in his loyalty to that empire. But Pearson was right and Diefenbaker was wrong, and it was when we have a flag today that is very much loved as a result.
I must say, like many others, my opinion of Diefenbaker improved with this book. I can say because there are a lot of things. Yes, there was, he was a progressive leader in Pearson, but Diefenbaker laid a groundwork for a lot of this stuff. That's true. So here's my final question. Do we see it today? This dynamic, is this being played out today to give us better policy?
We've never had it since. Remember, this was a contest that lasted for a decade, through two Diefenbaker governments and two Pearson governments.
Mm.
But we certainly have the dynamic of a prime minister who believes that the leader of the official opposition is evil incarnate, and only he can save the country from him. Stephen Harper thought that about Justin Trudeau, and I suspect Justin Trudeau thinks that about Pierre Poilievre. So to that extent, we are inheriting the politics of the duel, but only to that extent.
John, congratulations. This
Thank
is a fabulous read, and I recommend it to anybody. And I look forward to seeing the next one.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Well, that's our podcast. We hope you enjoyed it here on In Conversation from the Pearson Centre for Progressive Policy. Once again, we talked about The Duel, a new book by John Ibbitson, describing the life and times of Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the making of modern Canada. Thanks for joining us.